This is Henry Parsons Crowell. You probably don't know who he is, but you definitely should. Not only was he an incredibly successful entrepreneur and major philanthropist, but he changed the entire breakfast habits of the nation with a little company he started called Quaker Oats.
And a good hot Quaker Oats breakfast.
This guy was super entrepreneurial, brilliant in early marketing, brilliant in the technology, and he's brilliant in understanding what makes a difference to the consumer.
He represents entrepreneurs, activists, radical lovers.
While Quaker Oats is what Henry is most known for, his story is actually much larger and incredibly fascinating. Like many of his generation, Henry faced some hardships very early on.
What strikes me about Henry's story is actually its pain, and the sequence of deaths and other tragedies that he experienced were clearly really formative.
In his early years, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, the result of which was that he had to spend 7 years outside living. As a young man, he traveled on horseback through Colorado and California and explored the American West. While he would ultimately recover, in a very sad twist, his wife Lily would contract tuberculosis and ultimately succumb to it. These hardships, along with two pivotal moments in his youth, would ultimately form his entire approach to business and life. The first came from his preparatory school principal, Benjamin Mills, who passionately implored Henry to take your time and figure out God's will. So what seems like overly simple advice would actually become the foundation for the entire way Henry did life. The second key moment came when Henry attended a talk by the famous evangelist Dwight Moody of the now Moody Bible Institute. One night while speaking to a crowd, Moody offered up the now famous quote. He said, "The world has yet to see what God can do with a person fully consecrated to Him." These words so affected Henry that later that evening he went home and prayed that if God would give him the means, he would be that man. He would give God all the glory, and Henry's life would never be the same.
He gave his whole life to Christ, and part of the reason why the gospel landed with such power in his life was that he realized that the gospel actually intersected in the pain, that he needed a God who was exactly the God that he discovered.
And he knew that whatever he did, God had his back, he was guiding him, he was leading him. And I don't see in what I know about him that he had fear.
His whole life devotion to Christ causes him to have an expectation. His eyes are open to those opportunities. So opportunities come to him, and in some ways we think, wow, that's amazing. But he also has the eyes to see them.
Now, the story of the Quaker Mill is a great example of how Henry's desire to seek God on everything led to a huge and an unexpected blessing. Henry didn't start the Quaker Mill. He was approached about buying it when the owner at the time was having trouble making a profit. The owner had heard about Henry and thought that he might be interested, so he sought him out. Henry prayed about it and ultimately felt God was calling him to purchase the mill. Now, this is where it gets interesting. The mill came with the right to use a very special piece of equipment that would change the market for oats forever. At this time in the world, oats were horse food. It took hours to make, and they were sold in barrels behind a counter. William Heston, the inventor of this machine, and the man who sold Henry the mill, was working for one of Henry's future competitors, Franz Shoemaker, when he developed a new way of slicing oats very thin, drastically reducing their cooking time. When Heston sold the patent to Shoemaker, he made a deal that whatever mill he went to in the future, he would have the right to use the machine. When Henry bought the mill, he inherited the right to use this machine, and the rest is history. Henry was also a brilliant marketer. He did essentially convince a nation to eat horse food for breakfast. He changed the game when it came to advertising. He'd put ads in catalogs, and he took out these enormous ads on these massive signs so people on trains could see them, sort of pioneering the modern billboard. He also was one of the first true brand marketers. The Quaker symbol became synonymous with purity and quality. It didn't just matter now that you bought oats, but it mattered which brand of oats you bought. Henry's success wasn't limited to just oats. He also was a horse breeder, rancher, and even had a kerosene stove company with the then richest man in the world, John Rockefeller.
This guy who's a titan of business in 1927, a peer of John Rockefeller, the business success that he had that was woven all together with his philanthropy was a source of great joy. Henry was motivated by love. Love was a driving force to his philanthropy.
God also blessed Henry's personal life. Just like the business opportunities that seemed to fall into his lap, Henry would find love again as his friends introduced him to his future wife, Susan Coleman. As a married couple, they became some of the most generous philanthropists of their time and stayed true to Henry's promise to honor God first. When it came to giving, Henry was often fond of saying, "I can never get ahead of God in the matter of giving." Now, at a time when America was experiencing a very serious depression, Henry and Susan remained militant tithers. They funded medical missions, churches, prison ministries, and Bible translations. They would also pay the debts of people, medical bills, education loans, and gave money to orphans and widows. But time was just as important. Henry and Susan believed firmly in giving their time and influence to causes. When it came to impact, Henry's philosophy was adequate legislation in harmony with Christian ideals and backed up by courageous citizens. Now, in the 1890s, the Depression had forced many into prostitution to try and make ends meet. Chicago had become a major sex trafficking hub, and Henry felt the politicians were turning a blind eye to it. Susan and Henry were aghast at what was unfolding in their city, and they decided they had to do something. They leaned on their most influential friends, and Henry even used his connections at the Chicago Tribune to call out politicians who refused to address the problem. They formed a coalition of other leaders to attack it, and ultimately their advocacy was so successful, it resulted in the passing of one of the first major anti-sex trafficking bills in American history, the Mann Act. As Henry got older, he thought deeply in how his work was to continue and was determined to have their wealth go on towards accomplishing the work of Jesus Christ. He formed the Henry Parsons Crowell and Susan Coleman Crowell Trust, which carries on the work to this day.
So to the degree that the Crowell Trust and Henry himself becomes an inspiration for a much more comprehensive gospel, and to believe that the God who owns all things is the God who cares deeply about all things and all people. Young people understanding this can actually have their own generational moment of reclaiming, rediscovering, redisplaying, and reenacting the gospel in the world. Now that is world-changing.